US President Donald Trump recently said only one thing will work for the situation on the Korean Peninsula. What did he mean? Is Trump planning a military intervention or merely posturing? October 9th marks the 11th anniversary of the DPRK's first nuclear test, followed by the DPRK Workers' Party anniversary celebration the next day. Analysis indicates another possible weapon test taking place. Are tensions set to escalate yet again? During the recent visit of US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, Chinese leaders re-emphasized that dialogue and negotiation are the only acceptable means to resolve the DPRK nuclear issue. Standing in the middle of divergent parties, how can China contribute to denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula? The recent Golden Week holiday in China witnessed lower tourism between China and the ROK due to the deployment of the THAAD system. What other factors are affecting relations between nations in Northeast Asia, and where are those relations heading?
The Korean Peninsula nuclear crisis actually erupted on the 9th of October 2006, when the DPRK conducted its first nuclear weapons test. And this placed Northeast Asia in a much more complex and dangerous situation. 11 years on, DPRK has conducted 6 nuclear tests and made much progress on developing missiles like even the Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles. US President Donald Trump and DPRK leader Kim Jong Un's war of words continue to escalate as both sides show off their muscles. As tensions on the divided peninsula continue to rise, what solutions are being proposed and which are the most likely results of all these? To talk about these and much more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Mr. Rong Ying, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies, and Professor James Ray from California State University, Sacramento. And we will also talk to Mr. Li Taihuan, Director of the Center for China Studies at Sejong Institute through satellite. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. So on Saturday, US President Donald Trump again said on Twitter, only one thing will work in dealing with North Korea. He didn't elaborate what that one thing is. So, James, what do you think he's referring to?
Well, I think in his rhetoric on the tweet, he's implicitly threatening military force of some nature, but we hope that that's sort of a bluff to lure a strong posture into a negotiation process that will lead to a peaceful outcome.
You think it is bluffing?
I am not certain anything with President Trump. I think the consensus in the United States is there's not a military solution. I think his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, is committed to a diplomatic solution. But I think Donald Trump likes the theatrics of clean victories, and I think he's frustrated by this long period of diplomatic failures to finalize an outcome that leaves North Korea not threatening Western countries.
Provided his argument on Twitter, that is, 25 years of negotiating with North Koreans hasn't worked. It has not worked. I will make it work, meaning a different approach. He's been undercutting his Secretary of State, Tillerson. So he seems to be taking a rather different approach.
Well, of course, he's the only president that's never had any political or military experience, so I think everything is a learning curve for him. And I think the 25 years is a success in avoiding any kind of military engagement on the Korean Peninsula, because this is really the hot spot of the world with nuclear tensions. And so it's not a clean solution. I think Americans like finality. They like an end game. But this is going to be a long-term, ongoing challenge. With Kim Jong Un is very young. And in this situation, I think will rematerialize as it has for the last 25 years.
And on the next day, DPRK held a high-level political meeting with the Standing Committee of this Politburo, elected his sister into the alternate member of the Politburo. It seems Kim Jong Un has consolidated his power, and he said that the development of nuclear technology and missile programs is the right way. So, North Korea seems in any mood that will give up its nuclear programs.
Yeah, I think North Korea has made it very clear ever since, particularly I think when Kim Jong Un took power in late at the end of 2011. Then he literally, I think, pushed forward. Not only, I think, the testings and but more politically, they've already made into a kind of enshrined in a kind of a constitution. So it is, I think, very difficult to imagine that North Korea would give up its nuclear programs. But the big but is that if you look at the 2005, the joint statement in which I think North Korea committed to give up a nuclear program.
But that's 10 years ago, and under his father's reign.
That's right, in exchange for that. And he also said that denuclearization is a kind of teaching and left over by the previous, his father and even the grandfather. So I thought that there are both the rhetoric and the real sort of tension. It's always how you can manage, interpret. And I would just want to refer to the first question, that is, what President Trump really meant. Did he mean? I wish he was meant to say that the only mean is for him is talk, is peaceful talk, because for the past 9 months
unequivocally said that talking won't work. He said, Tillerson, don't talk to the little rocket man.
He never tried, I think. He tried everything so far for the past 9 months, ever since he took over. He tried sanctions. He tried, I think, bluffing. That tough talk of fire and fury. But I think he at least should give a try for me to talks. I think that is something.
But the problem is, who's calling the shot in Washington? It seems there is wide division in the political establishment in Washington, D.C. Trump on one side, and he's Secretary of State, he's Secretary of Defense, and also his National Security Advisor. Other ideas?
Well, in the Congress, one of his former allies, Bob Corker, has considered that Rex Tillerson is one of the few figures keeping the country out of chaos. And I don't think this is all a complex game that Donald Trump has mastered. I think he's in over his head.
The White House is an adult care center.
Well, and he's battling with Republicans, his own party. He is undercutting his Secretary of State, his Attorney General, and other figures. I think he is willing to talk if we've seen his practice on the health care in America, lose, and then make a deal, with Democrats to some degree. I think he's willing to change his course dramatically, but I think he believes that this threatening posture would work, but as was stated, the rhetoric from a few months ago didn't help. It escalated.
If it is simply a bluff, what is the purpose of making those outrageous comments on such
If it was a strategy, then I think it could compel North Korea to see the U.S. as potentially leaning toward a military, not likely an attack, but could put more military pressure on North Korea that jeopardizes its security, and that might lead North Korea to a bargaining table. But North Korea has always been willing to make a deal, and I think it maybe puts the U.S. in a more advantageous position in what kind of deal, and if that's really a strategy.
And do you think, in the minds of the Americans and the North Koreans, are they ready to talk? Really? Have they enough leverage at the tables to go on with talks?
Well, I think China has strengthened the sanctions. I think that has put more pressure on North Korea. And like when President Obama was able to get a coalition with China and Russia and others to put sanctions on Iran, Iran came to the bargaining table. I think the time is ripe to make a deal if the U.S. is prepared. And Rex Tillerson seems to have suggested he has channels to North Korea, is interested in dialogue, and if Donald Trump is willing to endorse that process, I think we could get to the same kind of framework we've had for the last 25 years.
You are very optimistic. Mr. Rong, do you think that both sides are really serious about sitting down and talks?
Definitely we should not rule out the possibility of talks. Maybe I think it would happen overnight, I don't know. But the problem is that at this moment.
And do you agree with James that sanctions have already worked? It has put enough pressure on North Koreans?
Now, sanctions will not work unless there will be talks, coming together with talks. That is what the UN's security resolutions or the previous resolution has said, and that is the point
this
China
round of
is trying
sanctions,
to
the
make.
most stringent ever. It cut oil, some of the oil supplies, liquefied gas supply, cotton export. Don't you think these economic sanctions have turned the screw even tighter on North Koreans?
Definitely it creates a lot of problems and difficulties for North Korea. But I think sanction by itself would not, I don't think it would be working unless it comes with the talks that is already in the UN resolutions. That's why China has always been calling upon U.S. And of course the North Korean side to come together.
So it seems you're suggesting that the Americans lack the willingness to really solve this issue. I quote Chairwoman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the NPC top legislator Fu Ying. She said the U.S. has shown no willingness to make serious efforts to take the real issue. It seems that she is suggesting that the Americans are not ready to talk.
Well, I think the U.S. is prepared for talks that lead to inspections regime returning that guarantees ballistic missile tests are ended, that guarantees nuclear tests are ended, and I think that's the lifeblood.
Can only get into negotiation with preconditions from the North Korea.
I think Donald Trump has been so critical of the Iran deal that he probably will set preconditions for a negotiated framework that probably would not be appealing to North Korea.
But do Americans understand that the North Koreans will never get into talks with preconditions like that?
I think the establishment in Washington and the bipartisan consensus is get into dialogue, and then from there the parameters of the negotiated settlement can be the typical game plan, which is allowing energy and food imports into North Korea, lightening the sanctions in return for a guarantee or a commitment to stop violating international agreements on ballistic missiles.
Let's try to think from the perspective of the DPRK. It seems the only strategy that's working over the past decades for North Koreans is to keep its nuclear program afloat. And that's the only biggest leverage they have in getting any kind of talks with the outside world. Why should they give up that?
Yeah, of course, North Korea would wish that they would never have to give up that only leverage of its nuclear program. First of all, I mean, for them, it is very much, it's so important for the existence of the regime, survival of the regime. They made it very clear, and they also publicly said they will never give up, right? But the question is that we have to talk with them. We have to show that not keeping that nuclear capabilities, it will be so costly. That's I think we will more or less have done, because that's what we do. But on the other hand, we also show that
whom? It's costly to the other partners, not North Koreans.
Well, North Korea is definitely, I think, as sanctions, I mean, going on, as you rightly said, it will going to buy, but it will take a long time. And I think in the process, North Korea may have already developed some ways of how to manage, I mean, the costs of the sanctions. So for that, I think I would argue that it have to come with offer of talks, unconditional talks, no preconditions. Start talk before. If we talk about, I mean, preconditions, talk about, I mean, what the ultimate goals of that conditions, but I think that would not.
To have them to talk, we have to set up the mechanism of talking. 10 years ago, why can't the six parties sit down to talk? And 11 years now, why can't they any longer?
If you look at the trajectory of the past 11 years, I mean, particularly I think after the signing of the joint agreement in 2005, I'm talking about September 19th. And the reason why it didn't work It's not the agreement itself. It is the parties, particularly I'm talking about the two parties, North Korea, DPRK, and has not sort of honored that commitment. And the first nuclear testing we're talking about, 2006, was partly or primarily because of, from North Korea's perspective, that the United States was not honoring its commitment. So as a kind of, protest or other kind of a gesture, that showed, its so-called capabilities to push, to put pressure on the U.S. side. So it was a tragic. And ever since then, that's always the case. Came back to the talk, table, started talk, agreed something, but never honored, and then started the blame game. And then, of course, now the new administration, the Trump administration, as I said, 9 months have passed, and no talk at all, even never tried. And then they say no talk. Talk is not working. So that was surprise. That's why I think what Vice Minister Fu Yin said that at least from the Chinese perspective, observed like us, say the U.S. does not have the willing. Is to have to.
So the standoff will continue or not, and what will be the ramifications in Northeast Asia? We'll talk about later in the second half of Dialogue. We're now talking about the DPRK nuclear crisis. Let's try to get to Mr. Li Taihuan, Director of the Center for China Studies at Sejun Institute through satellite. Mr. Li, many observers say that the DPRK leaders, the 3 generations of DPRK leaders, turn out to be the winners in this because they have succeeded in playing one power against the other, and with a consistent policy that is developing nuclear capabilities. Do you agree?
Yeah, in a way, they think nuclear power capability is already obtained in a way. They are so confident. So it is quite likely that we can see deployment of nuclear weapons within a short period of time. So I think it's that's the one reason why the tension is rising, because not much time left to stop this nuclear program, nuclear weapons, whatever. So I think it's they are too confident. That's the problem.
And many countries suffer as a result. For example, China-South Korea relations suffered. The trade relations has deteriorated because of your country's determination to develop anti-missile systems. Do you think this will go on, or things might turn for better?
Yeah, I think the bottom line is this. We gotta do something about this. Anything is better than nothing. It means, just that we cannot leave it as it is. So
you need deployment of that,
including the deployment of that. But that's not enough at all at this point of time to stop the nuclear weapons program in the DPRK. We need to mobilize all the possible means to stop them.
And is South Korea considering even developing or importing more military capabilities, including anti-missile systems and other development programs to counter North Korea's threat? And that will also pose a problem to other countries around you.
Well, actually, we have also have a right for self-defense. If a threat is increasing, we have to do something about it. The same thing is true with any country in the world, including China and the United States. Also, same thing. So, if we allow North Korea possess the nuclear weapons, it could be a disaster, not only to South Korea, but also to all the countries in Northeast Asia, including China.
So, Mr.
That's why we have to do
this
something.
seems to be the trend now. South Korea and Japan both want to buff up their military capabilities in response to the threats from North Korea, which is not something China wants to see. There might be an arms race in Northeast Asia because of what is happening in Pyongyang. What do you think that will lead to?
It is a big problem. I think I would like to go back to our Korean's colleagues, Professor Lee's remarks, point that for excuse me, in the case of ROK, they think it has to exercise its right for self-defense, and it has to do whatever it means to help for its self-defense. I think we don't have any problem at all. I don't have a problem at all. The question is that how to make sure these initiatives, or for example, like the agreement of ROK for the U.S. deployment of THAAD, is on the one hand it does not help. I mean,
but
itself,
they think it's the only thing they have.
And on the other hand, it undermines China's strategic security. I think for me, it might be wrong to make an analogy. It's like something like a similar, I think, North Korea is doing to some extent. I think, forgive me, I'm not meant to be offended. That is, they want for the sake of their own security. They are developing nuclear weapons at the expense of other security. So we need to make sure these the steps, I think, like the ROK, like Japan, that they are going to do should really help, certainly help itself, but more importantly also help the regional stability, the strategic stability. China has played a very important role. China has tried their best. I think it will be very wrong, it will be very unfair for China to suffer for this.
Is it the Americans' calculation that all the countries in Northeast Asia joining in a race to build up their military capabilities, that will translate into some kind of pressure to China?
Well, I think under the Bush administration, the theater missile defense that was the basis of these systems was more welcomed by the Bush administration, and then weaving in Japan into this, South Korea, etc., Eastern Europe, presented a potential threat, not a threat, but a interference sort of with Russia or China's national interests, even though the targets were presumed to be Iran and North Korea. I think under Obama that was moderated a bit, but I do think with the ongoing American calculation is to include these countries, and it does provide a deterrent to North Korea, but I certainly understand why China and Russia are antagonized by that posture.
And Mr. Lee, and another question is the nuclear issue. DPRK's nuclear program, of course, poses a serious challenge to the non-proliferation mechanism that is already in existence. Is South Korea considering counter this with its own nuclear program, and do you think other countries like Japan will follow suit? And what kind of world will that be?
Right. So the worst scenario is a kind of a nuclear domino in Northeast Asia, because already in South Korea, especially in a political circle, a lot of discussions of armament of nuclear armament, or reintroduction of a tactical nuclear weapons program, and even we are also discussing the sharing of the strategic assets with the United States, something like that. So it means the military buildup will increase in Northeast Asia, and not only in South Korea, but also in Japan. Eventually, it could be diffused into the Taiwan. So Northeast Asia is becoming more dangerous, I think. So that's why we need to talk about this.
So that's a very dangerous scenario. If everybody is trying to develop that kind of capabilities because of what is happening in Pyongyang. So it seems this is a likely consequence of all these. And how should everybody chip in deal with this serious challenge?
I think China has made it very clear. The foreign minister recently made it very clear, I think, Wang Yi, that there will be no new nuclear powers. And the NPT system we've talked about is being the most, I think, one of the most important system for preventing, the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Remember, I think in 1960s, I remember when President Kennedy at that time was very much concerned that the proliferation of nuclear capability that may be produced of more than dozens of nuclear powers. It didn't happen. I think we have to thank for that system. So the NPT system is so important, and China made it very clear. And it is also in the interest of the country in the region, and South Korea and Japan included, that to keep that system and working, and by honor its commitment. I think the discussion, the debate about in South Korea about either the develop of or reintroducing the technical is very dangerous. I think if history is a guide, I think the United States would be certainly come out and say no, because we know that.
And James, do you think there are enough core heads and to think along those lines and keep everything?
Well, I think the beauty is that China and the U.S. are on the same page strategically on preventing North Korea's programs. But I think there is some space between China and North Korea. I don't think North Korea and Kim Jong Un is listening very closely to China, and I think his assassination of his brother, his execution of his uncle, demonstrate his vulnerability and insecurity inside of his country, and his willingness to break international norms, if we can ascribe those acts.
So that's a leverage both China and the U.S. can use.
Well, I think both the U.S. and China don't want to see these programs continue, because it leads to this potential changing of Japan's constitution, the THAAD deployment in South Korea. So I think I'm confident that Xi Jinping and Donald Trump will continue their communication, will follow Rex Tillerson's approach, and work cooperatively to get back to a dialogue and then a negotiated process.
And in fact, they will meet in December in Beijing, and North Korea will be one of the top agendas.
Yeah, I think one of the most important agendas on the issues on the agenda.
All right, let's hope they can talk seriously and come up with something. Thank you very much, Mr. Rong, and thank you, James. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe Yeh. This is Dialogue. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.